Hello chess buddies, welcome to my Chess University. Before heading into the analysis, a huge congratulations to Irina Krush, the United States Grandmaster, for completely dominating the American Cup Women's Championship this year and winning it in style. She went into the championship finals against the 12-year-old Alice Lee, a FIDE master and women's international master who had a brilliant run in the tournament herself in the elimination bracket, but Crush dispatched her out of the championship bracket in 2 games and held on to a control draw in the final game to clinch the event. Today, we'll be looking into the round 7 classical game clash between the two in this tournament. So without further ado, let's get straight into the game. Crush here had the white pieces and she began with c4 going for the English opening. Lee replied with e6 going for the Agincourt defense of the English opening. Here Crush developed her kingside knight to f3 and Lee pushed her pawn from d7 to d5. Usually in this position, white pushes the pawn from d2 to d4, gaining access of this d4 square and preventing the d5 pawn from moving forward. But here, Crush moved her b2 pawn to b3 and Lee developed her kingside knight to f6. Now Crush moved her e2 pawn to e3 and Lee pushed her a7 pawn to a6. Here Crush moved her dark square bishop from c1 to b2, going for a fianchetto line, and Lee brought her queenside knight from b8 to d7. Now Crush moved her d2 pawn to d4 and Lee moved her b7 pawn to b6 with the idea of bringing her light square bishop to b7 next. Now we are in move number 7. Now there are 2 games that were played in the database with similar position, where white brought the knight from b1 to c3, which white went on to win, or the light square bishop from f1 to d3, which black went on to win. But in this game, Crush preferred to capture the pawn on d5 with her c4 pawn, and it is as of move 7 that we have a completely new game. Here Alice captured the pawn on d5 with her e6 pawn, and now Crush moved her pawn from g2 to g3. Here Lee brought her light square bishop to b7 and Crush brought her light square bishop to g2, with both the light square bishop clashing in this long diagonal. Now Lee brought her dark square bishop from f8 to d6 and Crush moved her dark square bishop to a3, asking for a bishop exchange. Here Lee captured the dark square bishop on a3 with a dark square bishop, and Crush captured the dark square bishop on a3 with a knight at b1. Now Lee moved her queen to e7, targeting this knight at a3, and Crush moved her knight from a3 to c2. Now Lee pushed her pawn from a6 to a5, and Crush castles on the king side in this position. Lee also does the same, castling on the king side. Here Crush moved her queen from d1 to c1, preparing to bring her rook from f1 to d1, and Lee brought her light square bishop to a6, now attacking this rook at f1. Here Crush moved her rook from f1 to d1, and Lee brought her knight from f6 to d4. Her further idea was to bring the knight to c3. Crush was aware of this, so she moved her queen from c1 to b2, and here Lee brought her light square bishop from a6 to e2, again attacking this rook at d1. Here Crush moved her rook from d1 to c1. Now moving this knight from c2 will open up this c file for the rook at c1, targeting the c7 pawn. So Lee brought her rook from f8 to c8, and here Crush moved her knight from c2 to e1, and Lee moved her light square bishop to b5, preventing any idea of Crush's rook coming to c6. So here Crush pushed her a2 pawn to a4, now targeting this light square bishop, and this forced Lee to move her light square bishop to a6. The best option for Crush here was to bring her rook from c1 to c6, but she moved her rook from c1 to d1, and here Lee pushed her c7 pawn to c6, and now Crush brought her rook from a1 to c1. Here Lee brought her queen from e7 to e6, giving an additional support to the c6 pawn, and Crush moved her knight from e1 to d3, preparing to bring her knight from d3 to f4 next. Lee prevented this by capturing the knight at d3 with a light square bishop, and Crush captured this light square bishop with a rook at d1. Here Lee brought her rook from c8 to c7, and Crush moved her rook from d3 to d1. Again Lee missed a very important idea in this position. She should have brought her rook from a8 to c8 and doubling up on the c file, but she pushed her pawn from f7 to f6. Now Krush moved her knight from f3 to e1 and Lee moved her rook from a8 to b8. Here Krush moved her knight to d3. Again she had the same idea of bringing her knight from d3 to f4 next and then target this queen. Lee prevented this by pushing her g7 pawn to g5. Here an idea that could have been considered by Krush was to push her pawn from f2 to f3, thereby attacking this knight. But here Krush moved her pawn from b3 to b4. Here Lee captured this pawn on b4 with her a5 pawn. Krush captured this pawn on b4 with his knight at d3. Now with a double attack on the c6 pawn. Here Lee brought her rook from b8 to c8, providing a triple protection to the c6 pawn. And in this position Krush again could have played f3, which would make a lot of sense because now Lee would have been forced to move her knight from e4 to d6, thereby blocking this protection from the queen to the c6 pawn. But here she moved her queen to b3, aligning her queen in the same diagonal as the king of Lee. Here Lee moved her king from g8 to g7 and Krush moved her rook from c1 to c2. In this position Lee should have again played her pawn from f6 to f5, but she moved her knight from e4 to d6 and it was a huge blunder because now Krush had an opportunity to completely dismantle Lee's game. Here if Krush captured the pawn on c6 with a rook, then Lee would have captured this rook on c6 with a rook on c7. Now Krush could have captured this pawn on d5 with his light square bishop. Now double attacking this rook at c6 as well as this queen at e6. Now the only move Lee would have been left with would be bringing a rook from c6 to c3, now targeting the queen. Here Krush could have captured this queen on e6 next, and if Lee captured this queen on b3 with a rook, then Krush could have captured this rook on b3 with a light square bishop. And if you look at this position, white has a distinct advantage with two additional pawns. But Krush actually failed to spot this. She moved her light square bishop from g2 to f1. She probably played this move to tackle the knight at d6 coming to c4. Now Lee moved her knight from d7 to b8 and Krush moved her rook from d1 to c1, now launching a triple attack on the c6 pawn. Here Lee moved her knight from d6 to e8, opening up the fourth protection to the c6 pawn in the form of the queen, and Krush moved her rook from c2 to c3. Here Lee brought her queen to d6 and Krush moved her light square bishop to h3, now targeting this rook at c8. Here Lee moved her rook from c8 to d8 and Krush moved her knight from b4 to d3, allowing her queen to target this pawn at b6. In this position for Lee, moving the queen from d6 to e7 would have been a better idea because even if Krush would have captured this pawn on b6 with her queen, then Lee could have moved her rook from c7 to b7, opening up an opportunity to attack the queen of Krush. But here Lee moved her rook from c7 to a7, and this was a huge mistake because now Krush captured this pawn on b6 with her queen. Lee cannot capture this pawn on a4 immediately because her pawn on c6 is under a lot of trouble, and so will be her queen when Krush captures this pawn on c6 with a rook. So here Lee had to move her queen to a safer position. While e7 was the best option, Lee preferred to move her queen to c7. Here Krush captured the queen on c7 with her queen, and Lee captured this queen on c7 with her knight at e8. Now Krush brought her knight from d3 to c5. This knight to c5 move is a brilliant idea because now this knight is defending the pawn on a4 while also preparing to deliver check by bringing the knight to e6 if the knight at c7 moves. So here Lee moved her king from g7 to g6 and Krush moved her rook from c3 to b3. Here Lee moved her knight from c7 to a6 and Krush moved her knight from c5 to b7, now attacking this rook at d8. Now the rook at d8 cannot come to any of the squares, so Lee was forced to move her rook from d8 to e8. Here Krush continued to attack. She moved her rook from b3 to b6 and Lee moved her pawn from h7 to h5. Now Krush moved her knight from b7 to d6, attacking this rook at e8, and Lee moved her rook again back to d8, attacking this knight at d6. Here Krush moved her light square bishop to f5, delivering a check, and Lee moved her king from g6 to g7. Now Krush moved her knight from d6 to b7 and Lee moved her rook from d8 to f8. Now Krush moved her knight from b7 to a5, triple attacking this c6 pawn, and Lee moved her knight from a6 to b4. Here Krush captured the knight on b4 with a rook, and Lee captured the knight on a5 with a rook. Now Krush moved her rook to b7, delivering a check, and Lee pushed her king from g7 to g8. Now Krush brought her rook from c1 to b1, targeting the knight at b8 twice, and Lee brought her rook from a5 to a8. Here Krush brought her light square bishop to e6, giving a check, and Lee moved her king to h8. Now Krush brought her rook from b7 to e7, and it was in this position on move 50 that Lee resigned the game. Here Lee had only 3 minutes left on the clock compared to 21 minutes for Krush, and the game position was such that White was completely dominating despite only having an extra pawn, and would eventually be triumphant in the end. So that's the reason why Lee resigned after move 50. A major part of this game revolved around this pawn at c6, but it was never captured. So that's the game. Krush received a prize money of $25,000 for winning the event and a bonus amount of $5,000. Her games in this tournament were a treat to watch. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.